Welcome to Overwhelmed, Syrian Refugee Crisis in Context, a Google Hangout hosted by the American Friends Service Committee. I'm Alexis Moore, Director of Media Relations for AFSC. Since 2011, more than 4 million people have fled war and violence in Syria, and millions more have been internally displaced. The Syrian refugee crisis took center stage last year as European countries tried to deal with the rising influx of refugees. Here in the U.S., anti-refugee rhetoric has been rising around the country, and many policymakers are still calling for measures that would shut the door on Syrian refugees. Today, we'll discuss this crisis with Raed Jarrar, AFSC's Government Relations Manager, who is based in Washington. Hello, Raed.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Giovanna Negretti, AFSC's Middle East Regional Director, who is based in Amman, Jordan. Hi, Giovanna.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Alexis.
And Layla Razavi, Director of Human Migration and Mobility, who oversees AFSC's immigrants' rights programs and is based in San Francisco. Hi.
Hi, Alexis.
We all want you to join our conversation. You can do so online at email at questions@AFSC or talk to us on Twitter. Let's start with you, Raed. We know that the heart of this crisis isn't in Europe but in Syria and its neighbors. Can you give us some background on the root causes of this crisis?
It's very complicated to know where to start because for many people they look at the crisis as one that started with the uprising in Syria a few years ago. For many, including myself, I can trace it back to the US intervention in Iraq that started exactly 25 years ago this month. AFSC has marked the 25th anniversary of the Iraq intervention a couple of weeks ago. And I think many of the dynamics that were introduced to the region can be traced back to the US military intervention in Iraq back in January of 1991. The destruction of Iraq's infrastructure and central government and the introduction of sectarian politics in the region. I know many people who go back even farther by tracking the Syrian government's own role in creating divisions, whether they were sectarian or ethnic, in Lebanon during the Lebanese civil war. But I think that might be a stretch. If we look at things that have been happening in the last few decades, there is definitely a role that Syrians and Iraqis and others in the region have played in creating the root causes for what happened. There is definitely a role for the US and other international powers, including Russia, in creating it. So when we look at it, now we're talking about half the Syrian population being displaced, around 10 or 11 million out of Syria's 22 million citizens have been displaced. The majority of them are inside the country, but there are a few million Syrians who fled the nation and crossed the international border. They are refugees. So it's not, when you look at it, it's not a crisis that was created by a natural disaster. This is a crisis created by politics, by military interventions, and it's a crisis that should be solved by looking back at the root causes of this crisis, not by trying to fix it by dropping more bombs or justifying more interventions.
Very good point. The crisis, which began as an internal uprising and became a civil war, is one that now has become internationalized. Can you talk about what should be done to try and end this violence, whether called it civil war or revolution?
Correct, and of course, what we call it is a very divisive issue. Many people call it many different things. I think your description captures the reality. This is an uprising that started as a non-violent uprising against what was perceived to be an oppressive regime, and then it turned into a very bloody civil war that has sectarian and religious undertones. Now, for who should participate in the solution and what can be done, these are big questions. You know, they will take months to discuss, but AFSC has been talking about a few feasible solutions. The first of which is ceasefire and diplomacy. And AFSC was among the first organizations, the first voices that called for immediate ceasefire by all parties to the conflict that goes alongside diplomacy, negotiations, and discussions. Unfortunately, so far we haven't seen serious implementations of large-scale ceasefires, but there is some movement on the diplomacy side. I think the other point that we've been pushing for is no military intervention and no foreign intervention at all. And this has been getting worse and worse. AFSC played an instrumental role in opposing a US military intervention, and we are still critical of other military interventions as well, including that of Russia or Iran or Hezbollah from Lebanon. So whether it comes from US allies or people from the other side, the organization and many of our friends and allies have been very vocal about the need to stop direct interventions and stop indirect interventions, such as arms sales and transfer of weapons to the region. So AFSC has been calling on the US and other countries to implement an arms embargo that would stop the flood of weapons to the region. So number one was diplomacy and ceasefire. Number two, stopping foreign intervention. And number three, which I think is the most important one, is a solution for Syrians by Syrians. And this will not be reached to by adding more fuel to the fire or supporting more of the warring factions or pushing Syria towards more violence. It will be achieved by getting everyone around the same table and having a ceasefire. AFSC has been very supportive of the efforts in Geneva and New York to put everyone around the table, and we know that today is a big day because the Syrian opposition is meeting in Saudi Arabia to decide whether they are accepting the invitations to participate in the talks. We're hoping that that will go forward and that will open some space up for discussions. At the same time, we are extremely critical for any military action that has been taking place, whether it is military action by Syria or military action by the United States and its allies. So it's a very complicated situation, but I think we can speak overall about what we should not do. We should not continue bombing. We should not continue sending weapons. And what we should do is we should start thinking about immediate ceasefire, not using food as a weapon of war, not using civilians as fuel for this conflict, and trying to open space for diplomacy and talks to reach to a political solution for the crisis.
Yes, political solutions and diplomacy always take longer than dropping bombs and hurting people. Speaking of people, we have a couple of questions relating to helping these folks, but let's talk about what we know from being on the ground with Giovanna. Giovanna, let's talk about these people seeking refuge. You recently joined a fact-finding mission sponsored by the Nobel Women's Initiative to learn on the ground what women and children in particular are facing as they take the trek from Syria to Germany. Can you tell us what you saw on that journey?
Yes, I was very fortunate to be able to join a delegation and the primary purpose really was to see firsthand what the challenges that women and children particularly are facing along the route. We went to Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and then Germany. And I have to say, seeing firsthand the faces of the folks who are traveling with everything that they own underneath their arms or on their backs was quite impressive. The biggest notable thing that I saw was the shift or the difference in which each country dealt with the transition of these refugees along the route, particularly the humanity. Croatia, for example, we met with the Interior Minister there, Ranko Ostojic, and their approach was very humane. These people are humans. We need to treat them with dignity, with respect. And all along the route in Croatia, they had very clean facilities with hundreds of volunteers trained and well-resourced to handle the situation. Whereas in Slovenia, for example, it was the complete opposite in the sense that the sole purpose there was to get them out, and get them out in a way that was quick, efficient, yet with no humanity or dignity whatsoever. People were dressed in suits that looked like E.T. outer space, as if people were a pest. The people looked in Croatia. The refugees looked, even though they looked tired, they looked hopeful. They had smiles on their faces. The children were running around, laughing, hopeful. Whereas in Slovenia, they looked like they had a huge weight on their shoulders. They looked tired. They looked with a lot of deep sadness. One image that comes to mind was this woman that came with. She had her 3 girls, and they were getting off a bus, and she had a blanket underneath her one arm, a bag on the other arm, and her 3 little girls were holding on to pieces of her clothing. They didn't look hopeful. They looked extremely sad. They were very tired. The girls had teddy bears in their arm. It brought tears to my eyes to just think that of the one thing that they could bring with them, each of them brought just a teddy bear to comfort them throughout the route. It just brings to light that these people are like you, like me. They just want to be in a place that's safe. I'm a mother. I have 2 young daughters. I couldn't help but think, where are these people going? Who is she? Why did she leave? What conditions would take someone to leave their home and the safety of their home to go through such a dangerous route? It was just so heart-wrenching. We were in Serbia, for example, and there was this other woman at a bus station, and we heard the screeching sound of a woman screaming the name of her child. She couldn't find her child among the hundreds of people that were there, and everybody was desperate. The volunteers, we were desperate. We didn't know what to do. Her young child was missing, and those are the little things that happen along the route that we don't think about. You just turn around maybe to wash your hands, and all of a sudden your child wanders somewhere and you don't know where they are. Imagine the grief. Thankfully she was found, the little girl, and we just all sighed a relief. But that's just one story of so many. And and I want to talk about the men. One of the things that I saw, the great majority of the migrants are men, and what's one of the fears that we have here in the U.S., that these men are, taking advantage of the situation. Some men are just crossing because they think they're going to be able to, either do something harmful or find jobs or whatever. Most of the men that we met and spoke to along the route, educated men like my brother, hardworking, that don't want to be part of violence, that don't want their families to be killed, that had their kids strapped underneath their arms or on their backs because they don't want their children to be part of that. They want something better. And I have pictures of little kids with their fathers waving from the train from Croatia on their way to Slovenia and then to Austria and then to Germany. it was just those stories will always be with me. A young man also in Serbia who was crossing. He wanted to be a doctor. He didn't want anything to do with girls. He didn't want to do. A kid who normally would be interested in video games. He wanted to get away from the violence. He wanted to be a doctor and help. So these are the stories that these are the people that I saw.
Let me ask you one other thing before we take a couple of questions. Who were some of the people who were helping these women and children and men along the way? Talk about them a little bit.
Yeah, this is the fantastic side of it. We met with local activists. I have to say, most of them women. Thank you. That were that mostly from Bosnia, who were former refugees themselves. These are women who had gone through a route similar to this one, a journey similar to this one, and had come back from Europe to their countries to do something good. And working with, volunteering in organizations or working with organizations, and I saw the pain and strain in their faces as they saw the migrants move from one place to the other because they lived this. And the horror stories that they told us of people who were selling their organs to be able to finance this trip for their families. They saw these things firsthand. They spoke to these people every single day. Volunteers, mind you, not paid. Right, so these are people who actually believe in this stuff, and the people who were actually the German, for example, a German teacher, young guy in Slovenia. He wasn't allowed to go to the train station to do anything. No one was to help the refugees, but you know what he did? He made friends with the police officers. So they would allow him at night to go to the platform on the train station when it was brutally cold to give out socks to little kids or a toy to the little kids so that the parents could rest for a little while their kids were playing. I mean, those are the people. Those are the real people like you and me, that just show us the humanity side of things, which it was absolutely beautiful.
Thank you very much for that. Let's move from the European side of the world to the United States. Here we speak of upholding human rights and protecting lives and promoting tolerance, and yet, as these values are positioned as the core of American democracy, we have many politicians who seem bent on subverting them by urging very draconian policies restricting immigration that go along with the immigration restraints that we already have. Layla, can you give one or two examples of these bad policies that are currently existing and some of the proposed policies?
Well, at any given time, both in Congress and in state houses around the country, there are a number of anti-immigrant measures that are introduced during every legislative session. I think it's helpful to go back to November, right after the Paris attacks took place, because we see that any time there is a moment of fear that grips national or worldwide attention, that's really when politicians start to gather steam in pushing forward these types of xenophobic and nativist proposals. So the Paris attack took place on a Friday, and by Tuesday, just 5 days later, 31 governors in states around the country had come forward and said that they opposed the resettlement of Syrian refugees in their state. By the next day, on Wednesday, the U.S. House of Representatives had passed H.R. 4038, which is the American SAFE Act, and later came to be known by many of us as the Anti-Refugee Bill. What that bill did was essentially throw up a number of procedural hurdles that would have effectively brought the resettlement of both Syrian and Iraqi refugees in the United States to a complete standstill. Directly after that bill was passed, there was a huge national outcry. I think a lot of us who are advocates for more humane policies were really caught off guard by how quickly the proponents of these measures moved forward, and we scrambled to action. There was a huge national outcry. AFSC, along with so many organizations around the country, started to mobilize and organize people to contact their representatives. And it was only then that a number of Senate Democrats came forward and said that they were committed to stopping this bill. And after a number of attempts to bring the bill forward again, both in December and earlier this month, that bill is now effectively dead. But I want to stop there and talk a little bit about the arguments behind this bill, and the arguments that the governors indeed also put forward. It tends to be the case during moments of scapegoating. We hear a lot of talk about national security threat. And I think it's important to talk about that and to dismantle that argument and to show it for the straw man argument that it really is. There are a lot of problems with refugee resettlement. It can always be strengthened and improved to better serve the needs of the people who are going through this very lengthy and arduous process. But that being said, despite all of its difficulties, we know that it works. The U.S. has had a long history of resettling refugees in the country. It is the most stringent form of entry into the United States. There's no other way of entering the U.S. in which you are subjected to more background checks. And I think it's important to say that not because we want refugees to be subjected to this, but because it really exposes the arguments the proponents put forward for the fallacy that it really is. I think that since then, the tone of the dialogue has changed a little bit and has become more favorable. But these types of conversations really harm our discourse. So at the end of the day, we're kind of back where we started. We haven't settled more or less refugees. There hasn't been a tangible impact that's really affected how we're reaching out to Syrian refugees. But what we have seen is that xenophobia, nativism, the type of hateful rhetoric that really is divisive and harms our national discourse takes root. And I think that's why we're so quick to mobilize against these types of proposals and why we find it so important to hold the line in fighting back and saying that these are not representative of our values and that indeed we want our country to be welcoming. The vast majority of Americans, when you talk to them, they support bringing refugees into their homes. There are church groups and faith groups all around the country that are really invested in doing this type of community work and welcoming people. And I think that as we move forward, those are the types of conversations we want to promote and to see more of in our discourse.
That's great. We have two questions. The first one, we're going to talk about an issue that some people don't seem to understand. There is a question from Jean saying there is no federal action on accepting Syrian refugees to date. How do we respond besides sending money or supplies to relief agencies? Can you clarify that one, Layla?
Sure. Well, it's worth noting that last fall, President Obama did announce that he would be accepting 10,000 Syrian refugees into the country. To date, I believe about 2,000 of those of that number has been met. So there's another 8,000 that he's committed to resettling in the United States. But it's worth noting again that that's such a minuscule number when you look at the sheer magnitude of the number of people who've been displaced within the region and the number who are fleeing into Europe. It's not even a drop in the bucket. But so there is that one federal action that's been taken place.
Okay, Raed, do you have any comments on the question of refugee resettlement?
Yes, AFSC has been very vocal and supportive. I personally have worked on a few projects within AFSC and outside for helping resettlement of refugees to third countries. But we should also remember that the whole system of resettlement to third countries is really only addressing the tip of the iceberg. So according to the United Nations own guidelines for supporting refugees, UNHCR or other agencies, resettlement to third countries should be considered for those most vulnerable populations, people who need the most urgent protection or health assistance or other types of needs. But the other and larger level of assistance is reaching out to refugees and displaced people, IDPs, internally displaced people within Syria or Iraq or other parts of the region, and help them at the communities that they are now. So how can we reach out to displaced Iraqis and Syrians within the region and help them reintegrate or ease their suffering on a daily basis, get them better life quality while they are in this limbo. But the most important solution for dealing with the displacement crisis is not to deal with it as a charity issue, neither by bringing them to the US or other countries, nor by helping them stay as refugees and displaced people, but rather the most ultimate solution is to find political arrangements that would allow for voluntary repatriation. And that is the most important thing. The most important thing is to address the root causes of displacement so that people would go back to their homes. So I think that is an important mindset to keep in mind. It's an important vision to keep in mind. The ultimate solution is not to ship all displaced people to Europe and the US. Maybe they don't want to come. I don't think that is the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution is to allow for the conditions for them to go back home. And that's why I think while we're talking about the resettlement issue, we should always keep in mind that it's only one layer of a multi-layered system, and that it's not the most strategic solution, but rather it's one of the most immediate interventions that we can have to help those who are most vulnerable.
Speaking of immediate interventions, we have a question from Bob in Old Chatham, New York. Our Quaker Meetings Outreach, Peace, and Justice Committee is exploring taking in a refugee family with the help of other churches in our area. It is something that would have to be approved by our meeting, but how would we go about getting a family, and what are some things we should prepare for? One of the answers to that question you might find from AFSC in Iowa, which is partnered with a ministry group to help support recently resettled families there. We can start with some of the basics. One of the things that most people need if they're going especially to a cold climate is the basics, like clothing. Raed, what do you think could be a good first step? What are some things that people can do if they're considering bringing a family over, sponsoring a family?
I think that the hardest thing for families who arrive to the US is the lack of a safety network, because the services that are available to those who end up in Europe are much more elaborate and more sustainable than the ones that we offer in the US. So the US support is usually limited in the amount of money that is given and the period of time. And unfortunately, the US is a harder country to integrate at. I'm personally an immigrant. I came to the US 10 years ago, and I had a very soft landing because my partner was a US or is a US citizen. I became a US citizen in a few years after that. I had a family network. But even with that, it was extremely complicated for me to get a bank account or to get a driver's license or to start getting my architectural credentials evaluated at the US to work as an architect. So these issues are important, and some support on that level would be good. But the most immediate support, of course, is to create that community feeling for people who are arriving without a community. It's very painful and hard for many of the refugees and asylees who get to the US to come to this entirely new country with no connections. And I think the feeling of community and connection and having a safe space that they can communicate and have interactions with others is really priceless. So, of course, many people will pay attention to the monetary and non-monetary support items, and people need money to live, and they need food to eat, and of course these things are important. But I think that one of the issues that get overlooked is the issue of creating a social network, and that will take years. But I think the more intervention and support we can have at the beginning, the first few weeks and months, the better.
The question of social cohesion for refugees is being faced in other parts of the world as well. Giovanna, would you like to talk about what's happening there?
Sure. Thanks, Alexis. I think, well, in Jordan, as you know, is one of the countries in the Middle East that first received the Syrian migrants, and about 5 years ago when this whole thing started, and they're now seeing the effects of the economic and social effects of the migrants moving out of the camps and coming into society and living in towns and cities. And these has economic impact for the government of Jordan, which is in itself a very poor country. Hospitals are overloaded, schools are overloaded, social services are needed for these migrants, and that creates a lot of pressure, particularly as it relates to people, job opportunities for youth, for Jordanian youth. So that has created quite a bit of social tension, and right now the focus of the international community really is about how to deal with, well, this is a reality. They're here. What do we do about this, not only economically but socially, to ease those tensions in those towns, in those cities where Syrians are now living and breathing? So that is something that we need to monitor and learn from the lessons that we are now seeing in Jordan. This is something that's going to be faced very soon by places like Germany and the United States in the coming years, although we have to note that 92% of Syrians want to go back home. This is something that's really important for people to know. Syrians want to go back home and see themselves going back home and rebuilding their country. But in the meantime, we have to figure out how we're going to build these social networks and this social cohesion that is needed to be able to ease them into society, but on both ends, not just for the Syrian migrants, but for the people who are the citizens of the country that are hosting the migrants.
Thank you. That's a very good point. We have a question from Steve. The idea of an arms embargo and a ceasefire sounds attractive, but also unrealistic. What makes anyone believe that Assad will honor a ceasefire or come to a negotiating table so long as he has the upper hand militarily? Raed, do you want to speak to that?
Well, the government of President Bashar al-Assad is coming to the table, and they are under tremendous pressure to do so. So it's not a theoretical or naive idea. They are actually participating in the talks. They took a part of the initial talks in Geneva, and they have been invited to the talks in New York. They don't have the upper hand completely. It's a mess, and they have initiative in some places. They don't have initiative in others. The vast majority of the country is outside of their control. So they actually have an incentive when it comes to that. But to answer your question regarding the principle, I think the principle is not like a nice, like as you call it, an attractive but not realistic idea. It's a very realistic idea, because when it comes to negotiations between the U.S. and Russia, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, we're talking about big players who are sitting around the same table, who can agree to a ceasefire, who can agree to ending their programs of sending weapons if everyone reaches to a mutual agreement. So it's not an out of the ordinary idea. From our side, from the U.S., we think that this should happen regardless of whether other countries are going to commit to stopping the arms flow or not, because on the one hand, that is the right thing to do. On the other hand, we have laws and regulations in the United States that prohibit us from sending weapons to human rights abusers. So whether we thought it's good politics or bad politics, realistic or not realistic, this is US law. Whether it's the Foreign Arms Export Act, the FAA, the Foreign Assistance Act, or its amendments, including the Leahy laws, they all prohibit the United States from sending weapons to countries or non-state actors who might use it for gross human rights violations. Unfortunately, there are so many instances that have been documented. There's very strong evidence that US allies in the region, including Syrian rebels, including the Iraqi government, including the Saudi government, have been using US weapons to commit gross violations of human rights. So we have to stop that regardless of our political analysis. It's an issue of abiding by existing US law.
The irony, of course, is that the United States, which buys and sells the vast majority of weapons in the world, is caught in its own sort of vicious cycle. The more weapons we buy, the more people make money. The more people who make money, the more they want war to continue. The more that drives people away from the places they're not safe, the more refugees arrive on different shores. And I would venture to say most of us, if we were in the same position, would also run away from violence and war. Let's discuss one other aspect of this, which has to do with the xenophobia being shown in the United States towards these refugees, and also towards the immigrants who have come from Central and South America. One comment I found interesting from the UN High Commissioner of Refugees suggests that the United States has refugee amnesia, meaning that after World War II, the UN High Commission was created precisely to help Europeans who were ravaged by the Second World War. And in this country and in this continent, a lot of the folks who are fleeing violence in Central and South America are doing so because of their policy, the impact of policies that the United States either tacitly or explicitly supported. Let's talk a little bit about that xenophobia in display with Central and South American, Layla.
Thank you for raising this point, Alexis. I think it's a really important one because oftentimes we think about Islamophobia as being one bucket of work, and then we think about work around Latin American refugees who are fleeing and arriving at our southern border as being a completely separate and distinct issue. But the reality is that the reaction that we see taking place in the United States, the type of nativist laws and reactions that come up towards both groups of people are really rooted in the same type of fear, and I think the laws function very similarly. So it's really in our interest, if we're engaged in doing this type of anti-hate work, to not think of our work as being separated into distinct silos. So people tend to think Islamophobia is about Muslims, and immigration issues are about Mexicans. But that really couldn't be farther from the truth. So right now, what's happening in the United States is, in fact, the number of people who are arriving from Mexico are at an all-time low. The number of people who are coming at this point in time are mainly from the Northern Triangle. So that's Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. These are countries that are ranked as being the most violent on the planet, with the highest homicides rate, particularly with regards to Honduras and El Salvador. What happened in 2014 is that there was a sudden influx of people who were arriving. It was predominantly children, unaccompanied minors, people under the age of 18, showing up at the southern border completely alone and presenting themselves to Border Patrol officials and saying that they're afraid and they wanted to seek asylum. There were also a lot of mothers and children who were arriving together. There was a huge national outcry. People thought that our border is not secure and we needed to rush to respond to this crisis. And we saw the federal government rushing to put up family detention centers. So mothers with newborn infants in their arms were being housed in these detention facilities along the border. Children were being stored at like military base camps while the government was trying to figure out what to do with them. And it was really a mess for a certain period of time. people seem to think that this came out of the blue and we were completely unprepared for it, but the reality is anybody who was working on these issues knew that the numbers from Honduras and El Salvador had been climbing steadily for a number of years. That was really when it just peaked to an all-time high. The numbers started to trickle back down at the early part of 2015, but by fall the numbers spiked again to an all-time high that surpassed the 2014 numbers. So the reality is, until the issues that are taking place in the Northern Triangle are resolved, we're going to continue seeing people arriving in the United States. But the reaction in 2014 was largely similar. We saw a number of governors and mayors, particularly along border communities, coming forward and saying that they were going to, issue the state guard or come out and make sure that they were toughening up the border. The reality is, again, local governments don't really have the legal authority to take an active role in that particular fashion in terms of responding. Immigration policy is really the purview of the federal government. So it was, again, a lot of rhetoric that was really harmful and really damaged the discourse. I will say one thing that's interesting when we look at the response to the Syrian refugee crisis. After the House passed H.R. 4038, really the community groups and the nonprofit organizations that came out to hold the line against that bill moving forward were primarily immigrants' rights organizations. There were a number of groups that were refugee groups or international NGOs, but the immigrants' rights community really spurred to action. And I think part of the reason is because we recognize that the immigrants' rights groups are directly impacted by the rhetoric that's taking place that's targeting and scapegoating Syrian refugees right now. The reality is that when either one of these groups is targeted, we see an uptick in nativism, an uptick in xenophobia, and that hateful rhetoric really spills over into all of the policy work that we do around both populations of people. So I think that as we move forward, we need to look for opportunities to bring the two groups together and not think of it as this is a Muslim issue and this is a Latino issue, because that's really not how the issue is playing out on the ground. I will say that AFSC has started to take a look at this work, and we have tried to do our best to think of this work as being cohesive and integrated. We have a website. I want to make sure I get it right. It's allofus.afsc.org, and if you go there, you will see artwork by activists around the country, and it brings together people who are fighting Islamophobia, as well as people who are trying to fight deportation and detention. We really see the two issues as being linked as part of our work combating hate and xenophobia.
And as we say here, no human being is illegal. We have a question from Nancy. Can you talk more about the role that U.S.-led military and economic intervention has played in destabilizing the region over decades? I am assuming the region of which Nancy is speaking is the Middle East. Raed, do you want to speak to that?
Well, it's actually hard to assume. There are so many regions around the world that the U.S. has played a negative role by destabilizing with military interventions. I mean, for what I just mentioned was that AFSC, we tried to remember and mark the 25th anniversary of the U.S. military intervention in Iraq. We actually published an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer under the title 25 Years Later, Still Paying for Mistakes of Gulf War. We also encouraged our constituents to send letters to the editors during the week that marked the 25th anniversary. And you can find that action alert and the op-ed on our website. Now, the U.S. military intervention in Iraq destroyed the central government. It destroyed the national identity. It destroyed Iraq's infrastructure, and it contributed to where Iraq is today, a failed state that has extremist and violent groups controlling parts of it, and a central government that is completely out of control with its human rights violations. It's divided among sectarian and ethnic lines. That legacy of Iraq definitely has affected things in Syria. It affected things in Syria both in the fact that many of the sectarian divisions were transferred to Syria as well. The fact that many of the layers of refugees in the region have also affected the dynamics in dealing with Syrian refugees. Syrian refugees came on top of millions of other refugees, whether they were Palestinians from 1948 or 67 or the 90s, or whether they were Iraqis. So the region was already overwhelmed with displaced people, and then this came on top of it. Or whether it came also as a result of the US military intervention and proxy wars in the region. One of the issues we talked about briefly was the US military exports to the Middle East region. For example, our military aid, the vast majority of it, over 85% of all of our military aid, goes to the Middle East. And that is an indication of how troubling it is to continue sending this military aid with no strings attached, with no watchguards, or even applying existing US law that would have prohibited us from funding many of these groups. On top of that, there are tens of billions of dollars that are being sent as weapons and arms sales. And of course, we have our direct intervention. The US has been bombing Iraq since 1991. We've never stopped bombing Iraq. Now we're also bombing Syria. We're helping bomb other countries in the region. So the footprint of the United States intervention and the legacy of the US intervention is really more death and destruction and sectarianism in the region. So we can't talk about what's going on in Syria as isolated from our own role in the region. And that's why taking responsibility and stopping the US direct and indirect interventions are really important as first steps towards creating a space where Syrians can start fixing the country. It won't end the war overnight, but it's an important first step. It's something that we can ask our representatives in the US government to do. Stop interventions, stop adding more fuel to the fire, and then we can come up with more sophisticated, proactive approaches. But we can't really come up with amazing ideas for diplomacy while we're dropping bombs on people's homes. That is a fact that we have to keep in mind.
Thank you, Raed. The phrase, "to whom much is given, much is required," comes to mind. If this country claims it is an exceptional place, then it ought to behave in an exceptional fashion. We have a question from Jane. Are there positive examples of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and grassroots groups serving women and children, where the women are trained in livelihood skills and services such as childcare are provided? Giovanna, what do you have to say about that?
Sure. Well, I have examples of NGOs and organizations and individuals that are doing that along the route. These are obviously very short-term services, but also I have some examples of organizations, mostly, again, women-led, that are in Jordan. For example, in Serbia, Women Organizing for Change and Croatian Women's Rights Group in Croatia are two examples of organizations that are trying to give information to women about not only their rights but the opportunities that they have, trying to address the needs that they have, the momentary needs that they have throughout the route. And informing them about the resources that they can obtain, and also providing childcare for them while they're in these transition stations or healthcare, etc. As it relates to Jordan, ARDD, which is the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, also known as Legal Aid, not only provides legal aid services to women, but they actually had been going to the camps, to Zaatari camp, and in Jordan, and now transitioning into the towns and cities that are impacted by the Syrian migration to do exactly that, provide economic trainings, particularly on how to make things that they can sell to get income and resources to their families, and also the Orphans and Widows Association in Jordan in Mafraq. Of course, the government also provides through their foundations, the Jordan River Foundation and other foundations that are larger also are able to provide more resources and more strategic programming. But the beauty of Jordan is that they are very much linked together. It's a policy that they've been able to pass, whereby government and NGOs are working very much in conjunction to be able to provide these services that are very much needed for the migrants that are in their country.
Excellent. It's good to know that people are stepping up with or without government acknowledgement or support at a time when many governments seem to be frozen when it comes to coming to a decision about this. We have another question from Teresa. What are the most important things for people in the United States to be doing in response to this crisis? We have several perspectives here. Raed, you want to start with the governmental response and what we can do to affect it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we can do as constituents is to keep pressure on our government to do the right thing. And Layla touched quickly on AFSC's work in the last few months, how we helped generate tens of thousands of emails regarding a piece of legislation that would have shut the doors on any Iraqi or Syrian refugees being resettled to the U.S. So for that, I mean, I suggest for our listeners today that they go to our website, afsc.org/Syria, and sign up for our newsletters. And that is a good way to keep posted on whether we will have any future action regarding any legislations or policies that we think we should support or oppose that would affect the displacement crisis at large or the resettlement to the United States. We are keeping a very close eye on developments that have been going on regarding a few legislations. And the bad news is that we will see more harmful legislations. The good news is that we have been successful in defeating them so far. But I don't think the fight is over yet. So we need to continue doing this. And I hope that many of the people, if not everyone who is joining us today for this hangout, would sign up for our newsletters. We have 4 newsletters. The 2 that I recommend that have to do the most with today's discussion is the newsletter on our immigration policies and the newsletter on wage peace, which deals with war and peace issues.
Thank you. Giovanna, how about the actions that we anticipate happening in the spring? What can we do about that?
Well, Alexis, as we all know, as the weather gets better, there's going to be an increase in migration from Syria to Europe. And I think that one of the things that we can focus on, and I would ask our listeners to focus on, is to advocate for a resolution to the war in Syria, particularly for the protection of civilians, to stop the bombardment, and also for Europe and the United States to open its borders. This is going to peak. This is not ending anytime soon. If we don't get to as Raed well mentioned, to the root causes of it, we really need to advocate for all of these things because we have a moral responsibility to do so.
Layla, what can our listeners do besides the items that have been mentioned?
Well, I think one thing that's really important to do is to think about how we can exert pressure on our local political leaders. So I think a lot of times we get really excited about doing large national scale actions, but the reality is that the type of anti-immigrant and hateful policies that have been put forward over the last few years tend to, by and large, get the most traction at the local and state levels. So you would be surprised how much attention both your federal and state legislators, as well as local city council members or your representatives who sit on your county board of supervisors, how much attention they all pay to the local publications within their district. So if you can write to the major paper in your local metropolitan area or your regional newspaper with a letter to the editor, anytime that you see that your elected representative takes an action that affects immigrants, whether it's Syrian refugees, whether it's children and families that are fleeing from Central America, or whether it's just somebody who's coming forward to put out a proposal that targets undocumented immigrants who've been living in this country for years. Anytime that somebody comes out with a proposal that either harms or helps immigrants and refugees, there's an opportunity for you to write a letter to the editor and to tell people, this does not represent my values. I think it's especially important that we hear from people who are third, fourth, fifth generation Americans, because so often it's left to immigrants groups and advocates to speak out. But we really need people who are ordinary, everyday Americans to talk about what we want our country to look like and what we want to see from our elected representatives. So anything you hear, I urge you, sit down at your computer, get a few friends to join you, send in several letters to the editor of your local newspaper, and you'd be surprised how much those get picked up.
It's true. Newspapers, editors generally expect that one letter represents the views of at least 100 people, and in this particular arena, we need all the voices of support we can get. For more information and resources on how you can help, please visit AFSC.org. Thank you, Layla. Thank you, Raed. Thank you, Giovanna. And thank you for our participants listening out there. We have been more than happy to bring you this Google Hangout, Overwhelmed, the Syrian refugee crisis in context. Thank you.
Thank you.